In this section, we're going to start off by talking about the U.S. air export market, the focus of our studies. Little bit of a history lesson here, but important to set the stage for all of our subsequent discussions. So let's focus on, for a moment, the evolution of the air cargo industry. We can fast forward from the founding of IATA in 1945 to the 1970s. This is where things start to get really interesting. But up until the 1970s, air transportation in the U.S., both passenger and cargo, was regulated by a federal agency that was called the Civil Aeronautics Board. And what that meant was, sub-bullet point, that airfares and air cargo charges, they were predetermined and fixed. And it's worth noting that the same applied to trucking and rail in the United States. So there wasn't any price competition between the parties. The charges were predetermined and fixed. So organizations, companies, whether they were truckers or rail companies or airlines, battled it out from a service perspective. But all the prices were set well in advance. And then, second bullet point, starting with President Gerald Ford in 1974, steps were taken to deregulate all forms of transportation in the U.S., truck, rail, and air, and let the market determine what prices would be. Competition between the players would determine what the prices would be, and the beneficiary would be the consumer. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter continued down this path and signed into law what was called the Airline Deregulation Act, the ADA, thus ending the regulation of pricing for passengers and cargo. Really opened the door for capitalism to work its magic in truck, rail, and air transportation. Continuing on with our little history lesson here, since the deregulation of transportation in the United States, the U.S. air cargo industry has evolved into four segments. You have all cargo airlines, as the name would indicate, they only deal with cargo. You have passenger aircraft that will take on cargo, but predominantly in the passenger business. You have the integrators, the FedExes, the DHLs, the UPSs, that integrate ground transportation with air transportation, hence the name integrators. And then a little bit more behind the scenes, you have aircraft leasing and charter companies. Companies that will lease aircraft long-term to other companies, or that will charter on a per-flight basis or a number of flight, short-term number of flight basis to parties as well. Freight forwarders engage a lot in actually this business of chartering aircraft on behalf of customers. We'll talk more about that later on. Second bullet point, the Airline Deregulation Act also paved the way for air freight forwarders to negotiate rates with air carriers and offer cargo consolidation services. Cargo agents were around prior to the ADA, but the ability for an air freight forwarder to really get in the game and negotiate space with airlines, turn around and resell that space to actual shippers, to importers and exporters, it was facilitated quite a bit by the Airline Deregulation Act. And that applied to both domestic and especially international flights. So air freight forwarding really started to take off actually in the early 1980s because it took a couple of years for the ADA to really take place. But air freight forwarding as we know it today really started to take off in the early to mid 1980s. In addition to the actual carriers, the all-cargo carriers, the passenger airlines, the integrators, and the leasing and chartering companies, there are a number of players that support the U.S. air export market, this ecosystem that we've alluded to on a number of times now. Let's go into a little bit more detail as to who they are and what they do. The U.S. air export industry is comprised of different service providers that, when taken together, make up the air export value proposition. First off, we have common carriers. These are trucking companies that support air exports through local pickup of cargo from exporters and delivery to freight forwarders. The trucking companies, they offer full truckload as well as less than truckload services. You also have line haul carriers. These are trucking companies that consolidate air export cargo at an origin location and deliver to forwarders and airlines at a specified destination, normally near large airports. So a line haul could be from Chicago down to Miami for exports going into Latin America. But it's usually from one major point to another major point. They're called line haul carriers, typically longer distances as well. Continuing on with the trucking theme, you have bonded carriers. We're going to see several examples about how bonded cargo is handled in the air freight industry. But for now, let's say that a bonded carrier is a trucking company that is licensed to move cargo in bond from a specific U.S. pickup location to a specific destination within the U.S. What do we mean in bond? Well, let's say, for example, cargo comes in out of Hong Kong to Los Angeles, but has not cleared through customs, has not entered into the commerce as the proper terminology is used, but is then transferred by truck. Let's go back down to Miami. Good example there for exports into Latin America. So a bonded carrier is approved by the U.S. government to move cargo within the United States that hasn't cleared through customs, basically. So a couple of examples of that. First sub-bullet point, withdrawal and delivery for air export of goods from a bonded warehouse or foreign trade zone. So that bonded warehouse could be an actual airline warehouse at LAX airport in Los Angeles, or it could be from a foreign trade zone. We'll talk more about foreign trade zones further ahead. Second sub-bullet point describes what we spoke of a moment ago. Pickup of foreign origin cargo moving in transit through the U.S. for delivery to a port or airport of export. The goods are in the United States, but they haven't entered into the commerce of the United States. If they're moving around by truck, by definition, that trucker has to be a bonded carrier. As a trade tip, and we'll see this, bonded shipments have additional documentation requirements. Some more trucking players here, and this will wrap up the trucking aspect of this discussion. But airport transfer companies, local companies that pick up cargo from air freight forwarder warehouses and deliver to airlines. If you had an aerial view of a large cargo-oriented airport, you'd see the ecosystem spread out around the airport, the forwarding companies, the trucking companies, in relatively close proximity to that airport. So forwarders will receive cargo from shippers. They will consolidate that cargo, prepare documentation, but then they have to get the cargo from their facility over to the airport. Sometimes they do that themselves with their own trucks. Sometimes they use third parties. Those third parties are called airport transfer companies. They're transferring the cargo from the forwarder's facility to the airline. Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about GSAs, as they're referred to, a general sales agent. These are companies that contract for space and rate agreements with airlines and offer that space to other air freight forwarders. Think of it as a wholesale model, as we see parenthetically, sometimes referred to as a master loader in Asia. But here in the States, it's a little bit different. They're called a general sales agent. And really what they do, instead of selling out in the open market to actual shippers, to actual exporters, the GSAs negotiate deals with the airlines, but then sell to smaller freight forwarders and offer them a price that's less expensive than what the smaller freight forwarder could negotiate directly with the airline. So the GSAs have large volumes of cargo so that they can offer prices to the freight forwarding community at a rate that the freight forwarder can still make money on. It's a wholesale model, basically. Air freight forwarders, the star of the show. These are companies that contract for space and rate agreements with airlines and offer that space on a consolidated basis to U.S. exporters. Sometimes an air freight forwarder has been likened to a third-party sales agent for the airlines because it's the freight forwarder that is out looking for the shippers, the actual exporters. Freight forwarders are definitely more than a sales agent, but in essence, and we'll talk a lot about this in upcoming slides, the air freight forwarder buys space or rents space on aircraft for specific flights based on the volumes of cargo that they can bring together, and they turn around and resell that space out in the shipping community. That's what an air freight forwarder does. In the post 9/11 world, there's been an additional player that joined the air export ecosystem. That is a certified cargo screening provider. That is a TSA-approved facility that can screen cargo prior to tendering to a passenger airline. We have a whole section on this, but in essence, if cargo is going on a passenger aircraft, it has to be screened first through an X-ray, some other procedures. The TSA allows for third parties to provide that service. They have to be certified. That's why they're called a certified cargo screening provider. You have DG consultants out there, people and companies that dedicate their whole professional lives to consulting on the proper packaging and labeling and handling of dangerous goods. They are certified in those areas and provide services out in the market. One can also find packing and crating companies, firms that exclusively offer specialty packing and crating services to exporters. This isn't limited to just air freight. See it a lot in ocean freight, actually. But there are companies, that professional carpenters, basically. We're talking about wood crating, a real skill that is provided in the marketplace. But packing and crating companies form a part of the overall air cargo value proposition. Now, as a trade tip, we should say that some air freight forwarders offer an integrated service portfolio that includes much of what we just talked about. Additional services like cargo screening, packaging and crating, and dangerous goods handling. So a freight forwarder, although the essence of their model is cargo consolidation, they offer a variety of other services to round out their value proposition to the shipper. We'll see what they are in upcoming slides. So what are some of the drivers of the U.S. air export market structure? Because in the age of deregulation, all air export activities are market driven. What are some of these factors that have shaped the way the U.S. air export market looks today? It all comes down to the fact that the deployment of aircraft and the availability of flights for service in the U.S. air export market, it's a function of several different factors. But we're talking about aircraft that are out in the field. Where are they? What are their characteristics? And how many flights are they running to and from where? What drives those decisions that airlines make? Well, one of the biggest in our first sub-bullet point is a concentration of export-oriented industries in a state or region. All the airlines in the world, all the freight forwarders in the world, aren't going to matter much if there isn't cargo to move. So there are certain regions, and we'll see what they are in just a little bit, in the United States, where there's a concentration of industry. So there's cargo to move. So that's one factor. That's an important one, actually. The U.S. needs more of that. Another big factor, and some might consider this an unfortunate reality from a trade perspective, is the volumes of air import cargo into a given market. We are a consumption society. A lot of our goods come in from, most of our goods come in from overseas, both via air freight and ocean freight. So if you have a lot of flights coming in from Asia, predominantly, those are inbound flights. That's air import cargo. Well, the airlines want to fill up their planes to get them back out to Asia. So the volume of air import cargo is going to drive the deployment of aircraft and the availability of flights on the outbound side, where U.S. exports are considered a backhaul. The head haul is cargo coming in from Shanghai into Los Angeles. The backhaul are exports going from LA back out to Shanghai. That's a big driver of aircraft availability and flight availability. Another one is passenger flights between U.S. and foreign destinations. Aircraft are so big today that they can carry hundreds of passengers, but also a fairly extensive amount of cargo. So we can't discount the importance of passenger flights as a driver of the U.S. air export market structure. Quite the contrary. The airlines are out there, the passenger airlines are out there to put people in seats, but they have plenty of capacity in these large aircrafts to carry cargo. And these passenger aircraft have actually put a dent in some of the all-cargo aircraft airlines volumes. Some other drivers are traditional and emerging trade flows between the U.S. and foreign countries. When we say traditional, look at the relationship between the United States and Europe. There's been trade flows going on there for upwards of 300 years. So there's always going to be cargo moving back and forth between England, London Heathrow Airport in England, and JFK in New York. Those are traditional trade flows, but also emerging trade flows. Southeast Asia, we mentioned Latin America, and also Africa. Another factor is the geographic location of airports to specific export markets. Even in today's high-tech world, there's still a lot to be said for just good old geographic location. Look at Miami as it relates to Latin America. What better geographically located airport can there be other than Miami for Latin America? That's an example of geographic location as it relates to a specific export market. You could say the same thing about San Francisco and its proximity to Silicon Valley and exports from there. Biotech exports from the New England area through the airport of Boston as another example. There's a bunch of them. And then the last sub-bullet point on this page, the supporting logistics infrastructure. It's nice to have an airport, but you have to have roads to get into that airport. You have to have bridges for trucks to cross. There has to be a supporting logistics infrastructure, warehouses, logistics parks, foreign trade zones, all the things that make up a logistics infrastructure. Let's talk a little bit about the top 10 U.S. airports by cargo throughput, not passenger throughput, cargo throughput. Published by IATA, it will change a little bit from year to year, but certainly over the last dozen or so years, these have been the major players, some of which are surprising. Well, the first one is Memphis International Airport. Now, anyone that's unfamiliar with air cargo might say to themselves, well, how does Memphis figure to be number one? It's FedEx's hub. That's why. Simply stated. Number two, Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. We all know that there isn't enough cargo generated in Alaska itself for Ted Stevens Airport to be number two. So what's behind that? It's also FedEx as a transit point coming in and out of Asia. What were the previous routes going back to the 1980s when FedEx bought Flying Tigers? That's why Anchorage is number two. Number three, Louisville. A pattern starting to form here. That's a UPS hub. Four, and this is more a reflection of geographic location and population concentration. O'Hare International Airport. That's Chicago. Just a huge airport that can serve a large geographic area and lots of people around it. And lots of industry, too, for the export side of things. Number five is MIA, Miami International Airport, as a feeder in and out of Latin America. Indianapolis handles quite a bit of cargo as well. Number seven, LAX, the gateway in and out of Asia, basically. Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport is number eight. JFK, a similar scenario to that of O'Hare. It's a huge airport, traditional trade back and forth from Europe, but a big Asia trade as well, and probably the largest concentration of people on the eastern seaboard, north and south of JFK, to distribute goods to and from. And then number 10, up-and-coming player, DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth. Now, one thing we'll mention before we move on, and you probably picked up on this already, every one of these airports, parenthetically, next to it, has an uppercase three-letter, let's call it an acronym. IATA assigns airports around the world their three-letter code. So Memphis, MEM, Anchorage, ANC, O'Hare, don't ask me why, but it's ORD, Miami, a little easier to follow, on and on. LAX, Los Angeles. But every airport has that three-letter code. We'll see more on that later as well. Top 10 cargo airlines, global ranking, not US ranking, but global ranking. IATA source, they will change a little bit from year to year, but this is pretty much the lineup. Number one, good old USA and FedEx. Emirates, which is out of Dubai. UPS, number three. Cathay Pacific Airways, headquartered in Hong Kong, very big player. Korean Airlines, Lufthansa out of Germany. Singapore Airlines, Qatar Airlines, Cargolux, as the name would indicate, out of Luxembourg City in Luxembourg, and then China Airlines. So these are all cargo airlines in what is a fairly accurate representation of year-to-year rankings. So now we're going to talk a little bit about U.S. air export cargo flows by region, city, and airport gateway, factoring in all of the variables that we've discussed up until now that represent the drivers of the U.S. air export market. Now, one thing we haven't mentioned, one term we haven't mentioned, is this airport gateway. And what does that mean? Well, gateways are typically larger airports that receive cargo from a regional area, a broad-based regional area, and all the cargo is funneled into that gateway. A freight forwarder will run a gateway, an airline will run a gateway. And actually, those line haul truckers, the carriers that we alluded to a couple of slides back, they will feed cargo from a given region into that larger airport. So let's discuss, and we'll run through some of the larger airports and how these things really work. So let's start on the East Coast, the Northeast, and we'll start with Boston. So Boston isn't a huge airport, but it could be considered to a certain extent a regional gateway. Cargo coming down from Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, and to a certain extent, northern Connecticut, all feeding into Boston, and definitely from Massachusetts, to freight forwarders who will prepare cargo consolidations, tender cargo to airlines, and then Boston Airport, the airlines, will ship out. Lots of flights in and out of Europe because of that traditional trade. And over a period of time, more flights in and out of Asia, but some of which require a connection. So there are direct flights, and then there are flights that have connections. We'll talk more about that as a part of the overall freight forwarding service model in just a bit. Move down to JFK, much bigger gateway, bigger airport, basically. More flights, larger aircraft, and more airlines to and from Europe, to and from Asia, to and from Latin America, to and from Africa, to and from everywhere, basically. So JFK Airport, not LaGuardia, but John F. Kennedy Airport, one of the larger gateways in the United States. Now you can move down and make an argument for Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia. Certainly there are flights out of there, but they're more passenger flights. The bigger airports are the ones that are going to have more all-cargo flights. And there's definitely a difference between an all-cargo service and putting cargo on a passenger aircraft. More on that further ahead. But continuing down, we'll come in from the coast a bit. Atlanta has emerged as a pretty substantial airport and region. Cargo feeding in from different places. Large freight forwarding community there. A fair amount of all-cargo aircraft, but mostly passenger aircraft. But Asia routes, Europe routes, Latin America, all over. Let's go down to Miami. We already talked about Miami a couple of times. The largest gateway into Latin America, based mainly on its geographic location. Good infrastructure, lots of people from Latin America living in Miami, so lots of work into Latin America from that city. Now, before we move too far to the West Coast, we can't forget about Chicago. We already talked about Chicago as a substantial gateway, receiving cargo from all over the place in that region, and lots of all-cargo flights as well, all around the world. You can move down to Houston as another example, over to Dallas as another, and to a certain extent, now we're moving left. Decent infrastructure, decent flights for cargo purposes out of Denver, a little bit more Phoenix. But once you get into Los Angeles, the West Coast, we're back into the big time as one of the largest airports, one of the largest gateways in the world, serving not exclusively, but lots and lots and lots of Asia cargo coming inbound, and then that backhaul flight for U.S. exports outbound. So a freight forwarder, as an example, in Los Angeles, with a regional presence, let's say a freight forwarder in Los Angeles is exporting to Manila in the Philippines. Well, they'll receive cargo from Phoenix, from as far away as Salt Lake City, Nevada, maybe even all the way over to Denver, although that's getting a little far away. But the cargo funnels into a freight forwarding operation, a gateway operation in Los Angeles, consolidated in large amounts, tendered to the airlines, and off the cargo goes, in our example, to Manila. Moving north, San Francisco, back in the day when Silicon Valley was actually making goods up there, was a large gateway for exports around the world. Outsourcing has taken care of most of that manufacturing base up in Silicon Valley, but still San Francisco is a substantial airport and gateway. To a certain extent, Portland. And then Seattle does nicely as well in the Pacific Northwest. So we'll be talking more and more about specific examples from specific cities and airports and gateways and types of aircraft and what airports have more cargo flights than they do passenger flights. But we wanted to get this slide out to start to describe how all of this works. We'll actually see this slide again in subsequent examples, but a good introductory illustration as to how U.S. air cargo export cargo flows work on a regional, city, and airport gateway basis. We're going to wrap up here, and when we return, we're going to look at the assets that drive the business, the types of aircraft. So we'll see you back shortly.